When you think about bright and quirky kids that you've seen over the years, what types of child anxiety is the most common?
In most ways, anxiety is mostly an equal opportunity offender, in that children are at risk of elevated anxiety and anxiety disorders, regardless of almost every variable that you could consider, whether they are whether they're bright or not bright, or whether they are, blonde or dark-haired, or whether they are boys or girls. Anxiety is largely an equal opportunity offender. But, anxiety lives in our mind, right? And in our imagination. And, imagination is a wonderful thing. And it serves beautiful and important purposes for children. But sometimes it also puts us at risk, because the more able we are to imagine, well, that means that we can imagine great things, we can be creative, and we can be imaginative, but it also means that we can imagine scary things and negative things and frightening ones and worrisome ones. And I think, in children who you might call bright and quirky, will often see a lot of generalized anxiety disorder, which is chronic worry, really. We'll often see perfectionism that might be, and frustration and self-criticism that is sometimes fueled internally by the sense that I should be able to be doing so much better and I have to do well, and anything that goes wrong is a disaster. And sometimes also fueled externally, because in my experience, bright and quirky children, or children who are twice exceptional, often run into a mismatch with the expectations of others as well. When people assume that they should be performing, whether that's academically or socially, at a higher level than they are able to achieve. And this can drive a lot of anxiety in children.
So true, so true. You say in your book, a child who is anxious is typically going to overestimate the likelihood of negative events and to downplay the likelihood of positive ones. An anxious child also is probably going to view negative events as extremely negative, more so than might seem reasonable to a less anxious person. So is this just the wiring they come by naturally? I know you make a point in the book to debunk the myth that it's the way that they've been parented. What's going on here?
And it's such an important myth to debunk, because it's so hurtful and harmful. And it's so easy to make the leap, which is a false leap, from the idea that parents play a role and can be an important source of support for their child, or can help their child to overcome anxiety by changing their behavior. It's easy to leap from that to the assumption that parents are the cause of the anxiety in the first place. Mental health, we need to acknowledge, as a field, has a very rich and rather shameful history of blaming parents for child problems. This has been again and again the case over the history of this field. Parents have been blamed for everything from schizophrenia to autism to eating disorders to everything else that you might imagine. And time and again, empirical research fails to support these hypotheses. And so they're theories that may have some intuitive appeal, but when we actually conduct rigorous empirical research, it doesn't back it up. And in the vast majority of cases, parents and parenting style are not the cause of children's anxiety disorders. It is, of course, possible to behave in such an awful way as a parent that you would have negative impacts on your child's mental health. Things like serious neglect, things like abuse. But those are not the story for the vast majority of anxious children. What is the story is a natural and innate predisposition and vulnerability. So yes, you could say it is the wiring that they are born with. Even when we think about things like parents who are very protective, if you are a very protective parent of a child who is not predisposed to anxiety, you're probably not going to make them an anxious child. You will make them an annoyed child because being overly protective to your child who's not particularly anxious, that can be perceived as annoying. But you're not likely to turn them into a child with an anxiety disorder. On the other hand, when your child does have that predisposition, when they do have that vulnerability, then how you respond to the child, that does matter. And that can be in more helpful ways that might help them to cope better, and it might be in less helpful ways that actually make it harder for them. But that's not the same as the idea that parents caused anxiety disorders in the first place.
So for parents listening, no, that is not your fault. Not at all. That's such a healing message. Thank you so much.